どうも皆さん、こんにちは。ウエストランド蒸留所のブランドアンバサダー、ジャック・チェンバーズです。今年の秩父ウイスキー祭りへようこそ。ウエストランドはですね、ワシントン州のシアトル市のアメリカンシングルモルトの蒸留所なんですけれども、今はまだなかなかワシントン州には行けないからこそ、今年の秩父ウイスキー祭りのためにですね、ウエストランドのヘッドディスティラー、マット・ホフマンさんがワシントンにある大切な場所をご案内していただきます。まずは、こちらのギャリアナのギャリオーク材を育てている場所をご案内してもらいます。そして次は、こちらのコレレですね。コレレの、大麦。ワシントン州内の大麦を使用しているウイスキーなんですけれども、こちらはスカジット・バリーという場所に育てていただいてますので、そのスカジット・バリーをご案内していただきます。で、最後は、ちょっとまだ市場には出てないウイスキーなんですけど、ソイラムというワシントン州のピートを使用しているウイスキーなんですが、そのピートの場所をご案内してもらいますので、ぜひアメリカンピーテルウイスキーについても、マット・ホフマンさんから、楽しみにご覧ください。どうぞ。
Hello and welcome to Westland Distillery here in Seattle, Washington. My name is Matt Hofmann. I'm the co-founder here at Westland. Now, unfortunately, you can't be here with us today, and it's a real disappointment because we would have loved to have had you out here, but we know that the way that the world is going this year means that it's really not in the cards. However, we are working on something that's really, really important that we wanted to share with you all, and that is our new Outpost range of whiskeys. So what we'd like to do is to take you on a virtual tour of three of the really important parts of what makes the Outpost range possible. So first, we're going to take you on a tour of the Shebig Preserve, which is just outside of Tacoma, Washington, where we're planting Gary Oaks. We're also going to take you to the Skagit Valley, where we're working with Skagit Valley Malting, with the Bread Lab, working with farmers there to find and develop new varietals of barley that could be used for whiskey. And finally, we're going to go take a look at a peat bog that's down in Shelton, Washington, and look at all the different flora that make up the collection of Washington state peat and make it really unique and really interesting. Hi everybody, welcome to the Shebig Lakeview Nature Preserve here just outside of Tacoma, Washington, about a 45-minute drive south of our distillery in Seattle. And the reason why we're here today is because this is one of the last remaining homes of Gary Oak in the Pacific Northwest. We've been using Gary Oak to make casks since 2011, and our Garyana whiskey release program has been out since 2016. At that same time, we started habitat restoration with Gary Oaks and been working with a company called Forterra to help in that process. We're here at the Shebig Lakeview Nature Preserve, not just because of these beautiful big oaks that you can see behind me, but also because we've been working to plant hundreds of smaller oaks over the past 4 years. So we're going to show you around today and show you what a Gary Oak savanna looks like. So the tree that you can see behind me is one of many examples on this property of a mature Gary Oak. This tree is going to be at least 150 years old, but probably much more likely to be 200 or even 300 years old. Now, these trees are really, really rare. They're only growing in about 3 to 5% of their former habitat. And their habitat is here exclusively in the Pacific Northwest, starting from just north of Vancouver, BC, and a little bit onto Vancouver Island around Victoria, as well as down through the greater Seattle area, Tacoma, where we are now, and then down to Portland and a little bit to Northern California, basically following the I-5 corridor. The range is only about 50 miles wide. It's a really small range for a species of oak, especially compared to Quercus alba, the American white oak. So what we're trying to do here is to call attention to the fact that this is our native species of white oak. There's only a few species of white oak that get used in the world for whiskey. There's Quercus alba, the American white oak that grows in the eastern half of the country, the European oaks, Japanese oak, and this is the next one. It's an incredibly exciting opportunity for us here at Westland. It's very important that everybody understands that we don't cut these beautiful trees down. What we're doing is exclusively using naturally fallen oak. So when a tree gets to this size, maybe a little bit bigger, and it reaches the end of its lifespan, you have powerful windstorms that will pull these trees down, either uprooting them or splitting the trunk and knocking them down. The only wood that we use in our Garyana oak program is wood that has fallen this way. We've never cut a Garyana oak tree down, and we never will. As you can see here, these trees are actually spaced really far apart, and that's because we don't really think about this as a forest. Actually, it's more of what we call a savanna. So a big part of what we've been trying to do out here with Forterra is to not just replant these Gary oaks, but to actually try to reestablish what a Gary oak savanna ecosystem, a holistic ecosystem, looks like. So there's a lot of additional challenges that come with using Gary oak, in addition to the fact that it's just hard to get. For example, these trees, as they grow, they're growing wild. And when they grow wild like this, they tend to, as you can see, shoot out these really big branches and very low off the ground. And the thing is, while that's a really beautiful thing to have in these trees, it actually makes it very difficult for us to turn it into barrels. Essentially, any time that you have one of these branch points come off, that renders basically the rest of the tree from there up useless for making staves because of the type of construction we need in quarter sawing the oak. So that's our first big issue. The second big thing is that Gary oaks as a species have a lot of tannins in the wood. And those tannins in the wood are there for the tree to help protect itself. But we need to break those tannins down, otherwise you get too much bitterness in the wood, in the whiskey itself. So we have to cut it and dry it for 3 years before we can even begin to build barrels. This is the longest drying period of any major oak species that we are aware of. So what we're looking at here is a Gary oak, one of the Gary oaks that we planted out here over the past few years. Now, what we do when we're out here working with Forterra to plant one of these, first thing we need to do is get these invasive grasses down. So all these grasses that you're seeing here, these are invasive species. We tamp them down with cloth in about maybe a 6-foot diameter in total. And once we get that down, and obviously they're beginning to grow back here a little bit, what we do is we dig a hole, and again, this is really rocky, gravelly soil, about 1 foot deep, and we're going to put these Gary oaks in. At the time, they're about, maybe about 1/4 of the size of this, really, really small. Putting them there, burying the roots, and then we're putting these protective shields around it. This is to prevent wildlife from eating these young saplings, and they're going to stay on here basically until they're established enough where if a little rabbit or some other sort of creature comes up and tries to destroy it, it can still survive. So this one's looking really healthy. You can see not just the leaves here, but also budding out and beginning to grow for the next year. And so this is one of hundreds that we've planted out here, and they're growing. So part of the challenge in trying to rebuild this Gary oak savanna and this Gary oak ecosystem is the fact that these Gary oak trees are really slow growing. This is one of the first trees that we planted, and it's a really successful, really healthy looking tree, but this is 4 years old, and it is, 4 or 5 feet tall. So, it's a really slow growing process. It takes a long time to get to a point where even if we could harvest it, which we can't because it's a nature preserve, but even if we could, we'd want to 150 plus years. But what we're trying to do here is not just plant some of these Gary oaks and expect all of them to grow up into these massive trees like you see behind me. For all of these Gary oaks we plant, we expect up to 90% attrition. So up to 90% of the oaks that we plant, we expect to fall out. Now some of these, you can see maybe a few of these ones that are behind me. These will be much smaller. And they might die out right away. Some of them might take 20 years to be thinned out, because eventually you can see how much spacing these trees actually need once they grow to full size. So we're planting these about 10 feet apart, and even if they're all growing, these two here are growing really successfully next to each other, eventually there's going to be competition between the two. While the concept of the Outpost Range will be new to you, Garyana will not. This is the 5th iteration of our Garyana release series. And what we're trying to do with Gariana in the whiskey is exactly what we're trying to do with Gariana in general as a species. We're trying to explore it. We're trying to learn a lot more about it. We had released some casks initially and we got to know the fundamental flavor profile of Gariana oak. And that is heavy molasses, dark clove. It turns our fruitiness that we have in our house style into really dark, kind of jammy blackberry, blueberry fruits. And there's an element of smokiness to it as well. It's very distinct for a species of oak. But once we learned that, our next mission was to discover how it begins to work with other things in our house style. How does it begin to play with American white oak? Or how does it work with our 5-malt recipe? For this 5th edition, the sample that you've got, what we're trying to explore is Gary oak and peat. And in fact, the synergistic qualities that we have in the phenolic profile of Gary oak as well as the peat. And the result is really, really cool. It's spicy, it's smoky, it's a little bit savory. It's kind of got this burnt barbecue sort of thing, burnt ends sort of thing that's smoked with peat. It's amazing. So what we've been trying to do is explore something new in each iteration, and that's what the Gariana series and really what the Outpost series is all about. Trying to push the envelope and create something new in the category of single malt. Welcome to the beautiful Skagit Valley. We are standing out here amidst some barley fields that are growing. They're going to be ready to harvest here in just a few weeks' time. And this valley is very, very important to us because it's helped us seek out one of our main goals from the beginning, which is to find flavor in barley. Now, when we started Westland, we said there's got to be some flavor in barley, and yet the industry didn't want to talk about it. It's made from 100% malted barley. Single malt is 100% malted barley, and yet it was never explored and never talked about. So when we started the company, at first we're looking at roasted malts, taking influence from the brewing industry, which is of course so important to us here in the Pacific Northwest. Roasted malts that are used to make dark beers, porters, stouts, amber ales. That's what we had available to us from the beginning. But there was the other half of the equation, and that was the barley varietal flavor that existed just on its own without any roasts. But we were really limited in what we could do from the beginning. There was only a handful of barley varietals that were approved by the commodity system. So what we had to do starting in 2012 was begin working directly with farmers, maltsters, and breeders to find new barley varietals like those you're seeing around me. Right now we are standing in front of what appears to be a truly beautiful spring barley field as part of the Headland family farms here in the Skagit Valley. Now this field and the rest of the farm around it are about 90 acres in total. That's really not a very big farm compared to other farms around the US, but here in the Skagit Valley it is relatively large. And it's relatively large because the Skagit Valley itself is pretty small, pretty tiny, and growers tend to focus on a couple of things and just try to do those things really, really well. This valley is only 80,000 acres, but within those 80,000 acres, all these growers and their specialties, they grow a total of 80 different crops of commercial significance. 80. That's really, really extraordinary. Typically in an agricultural area, you might see 1 or 2, like a corn or soybean rotation, but 80 different crops of commercial significance here. Now, the problem with that is that barley is literally the 80th most valuable crop that's being grown here, and wheat is not that much better at number 79. In fact, Dave Headland, the owner of the farm here, he always says, we used to grow grains for fun and occasional profits. Well, that's not going to work in the long run. You need to be able to have some profit in order to make this work. So that's what we're trying to do here, is we're working with these farmers who need to grow this grain. Now, why do they need to grow this grain? It plays a huge role in helping those other 78 crops grow successfully in this valley. Barley and wheat will put a lot of carbon back into the ground, put a lot of organic matter back into the ground. In fact, when we get an acre of barley off of the field, you get 3 tons that will go to the malt house and that we will eventually get at the distillery. For every 3 tons you get to the malt house, you get 8 tons of this organic matter that goes back into the soil to help replenish the next round of crops. So it plays this massive role in rotation-based farming. And that's what's going on here. So what we're trying to do here in the Skagit Valley is just play a role along with the farmers, along with the maltsters, along with the breeders to help them make a successful living in farming. It might seem pretty ordinary that we are working directly with farmers here in the Skagit Valley, but actually for the whiskey business, for the single malt whiskey business using barley, that's actually really, really rare. Most commodity barley industries actually forbid distilleries and clients from learning who their farmers are and meeting them. That's what the commodity system does. It's about separating people out so you don't need to know who anybody in the chain is. That has some advantages, but it also has some really tremendous disadvantages. And the disadvantages come all the way down to if you want to drive something forward, if you want to look at new barley varietals, if you want to push sustainability forward, if you want to look at new ways of farming grain that is economically viable for farmers, none of that can happen without the farmers' input. And that's why it's so important that we work with farmers like Dave Headland and all the others here in the Skagit Valley. So we are standing right now inside of the bread lab. It might look a little bit like a bakery, and that's because, well, it is one, kind of at the same time. It's a research institution, but it also has all of this equipment that helps the researchers find out what the flavor implications are of the research that they're doing. Now, this journey started back in 2012. Already in 2012, as a 2-year-old company, we were finding that the types of barley varietals that we were looking for, the idea of flavor in barley varietals, didn't exist in the commodity system. So we came up here to something called the Kneading Conference, again, very bread focused, and we were looking to meet farmers originally. And this is how we got connected to Dr. Steve Jones. Dr. Steve Jones runs this lab along with a number of other breeders and administrative officials who are all part of this, and this is part of Washington State University here in Mount Vernon, about an hour's drive north of Seattle. So that journey started 8 years ago with the bread lab, and we've been working hand in hand with them ever since. And really that relationship has continued to develop as we progressed. Starting in 2015, we began to financially sponsor the bread lab. Because the thing is, the bread lab doesn't get a ton of outside funding, especially for barley research. So we began to fund barley research in 2015, and just last year we committed to fully funding a 4-year PhD student program that focused on barley research. It's partners like these that we need in order for us to accomplish what we believe is possible in the future of single malt. So Dr. Steve Jones is just the 5th wheat breeder in the history of Washington State University's wheat breeding program, a program that started in 1894. But Steve's journey really transformed in 2008 when he came out here from the main campus in Pullman. So the main Washington State University campus is about a 6-hour drive away from where we are today. When he came out here, he essentially removed himself from the commodity system that many of the breeders had used coming before. And when he left the commodity system, all of a sudden, he was free to do a lot of the things that the commodity system actually didn't want before. So in the commodity system, they weren't looking for nuance, they weren't looking for flavor, they weren't looking for sustainability, they weren't looking out for the farmer either. And all of a sudden, he could begin to reimagine a system of grain and agriculture that brought in all of that stuff, that was holistically sustainable, that was going to be successful for the people, the farmers, and for us in terms of the flavor that we were going to bring to the table. And this, I cannot stress enough the importance of this. Without a figure like Steve Jones and really everybody here at the Bread Lab, none of this can happen, because we might have the best of intentions as a whiskey distillery, or even if you're a malt store or even a farmer, but without a central point, a central figure that's looping all of us together, finding these new varietals and breeding them, that's what allows all of this to work. So Dr. Steve Jones, he's really at the core of this entire project. So right now we are in what I think is one of the coolest rooms inside of the Bread Lab, and that's the seed bank. So what you're seeing here are different varietals of grains, but also things like beans and buckwheat as well, which isn't technically a grain, that are lining these walls, and there's packages everywhere, thousands of different varietals of grains in here. I mean, you're looking at these different buckwheats here, which are part of a good, healthy agricultural rotation. They're very good for honeybees. You got this like purple Egyptian barley varietal. That's a 2,000-year-old varietal from Egypt. You've got a lot of other grains, wheats primarily, but then back here we have a lot of the barleys. Now, one of the benefits of a seed bank like what you've got here is that all of these can be grown back out. They're live. They can be grown back out and crossed with things. So this is the benefit of being a breeder that has a connection back to 1894. And in fact, some of the varietals go back almost 500 years, believe it or not. And what they're trying to do here is to take traits from different barley varietals, cross them together. So we're not about going backwards. That's very important. We're not trying to find just an ancient varietal. We're trying to take the characteristics maybe of an ancient varietal and cross them against modern new varietals and create something that works for today's environment, today's farmers, and today's palates. So this varietal right here, Alba, is a particularly special varietal for us and our relationship with the Bread Lab and the Skagit Valley in general, because this varietal was what kicked the whole thing off. The Alba Varietal was being grown by one of the farmers here in the Skagit Valley. And the farmer was growing it really well. It helped his soil out quite a bit, is returning a lot of carbon to the soil. He was getting a lot of yield from it, but it wasn't an approved commodity varietal. And so he had approached Steve Jones at the Bread Lab in Skagit Valley Malting and said, I need to find a way to add value to this grain because it grows really well in this climate. And that is how the birth of this idea of connecting Skagit Valley grain to Skagit Valley malting and then eventually us turning this into whiskey. So Alba was the very first varietal that we got from Skagit Valley malting, and it will be the very first edition of Colere. So before we go inside of Skagit Valley malting here, what's really important to understand is that originally we were going to try to do this ourselves. We were going to try to start our own malting company. In fact, that's why we came up to the kneading conference at the Bread Lab in 2012, was to get closer to the farmers, to meet those farmers, and eventually start our own malting company. But as you'll see when we go in here, it's definitely a really complicated effort. So what you can see behind me, these machines, now these may look big, and Skagit Valley malting is the biggest of the new wave of craft maltsters in the US. But a 10-ton output for a malting machine is actually really, really small compared to the conventional malting system. But there's a reason why they've done it. They just didn't be small for the sake of being small. They designed systems where you could have individual machines because that way you could keep varietals separated from each other. You have a different farmer, perhaps a different field. You can have these different varietals being grouped together. Without that, none of the ability to separate and identify different characteristics would be possible. Right now we are at Skagit Valley Malting's grain handling site, just a little bit up the road from their main malting site. And what you can see behind me is we've got grain coming in. It's coming in right off the fields right now. This is the beginning of harvest season. We were told earlier that this is Talisman, one of the brand new barley varietals that we have been working with, that we have actually used to make whiskey. This is some of this coming off the field right now. It's being weighed and it's going to be taken around the back and put into one of these silos for drying. So what you can see behind me right now, that truck is coming from the Washington Bulb Company. Now this is actually one of the primary farmers that we in Skagit Valley Malting work with. Washington Bulb Company is one of the largest tulip growing operations outside of Holland. And this region, the Skagit Valley, is the largest tulip growing region outside of Holland. But what tulips need after they're grown is barley to go into the soil to replenish the organic matter to break disease cycles. So barley is actually super important to the tulip economy here. John Rusin, the farmer who grows this grain for us, he also grew that very first crop of Alba Varietal barley for us. That will be in our first edition of Colere. This first edition of Colere is made with the Alba Varietal. Now, the Alba Varietal is a pale tan varietal that's been grown in the Skagit Valley for a long time as part of these healthy crop rotations. But it's also got a really, really interesting flavor profile. what we tried to do is we tried to preserve the integrity of that flavor profile. So we didn't actually use any new oak. That was very, very important to our program in using these new varietals. Using used Westland barrels, so previously used barrels by us, and also previously used bourbon barrels, helped to capture the integrity of the flavor from the barley varietal without overpowering it with oak. So what you get out of that is this really beautiful, it's like roasted pineapple. You know, if you start a grill and you've got some pineapple, you put it on the grill, this kind of roasted pineapple note. And then it's got a kind of like a jasmine or a violet sort of floral character. It's subtle and it's elegant. I think this is one of the really fun examples of whiskey making where you get this elegant style. It's complex, but it's not overpowering. And then on the palate, for sure, the fruitiness right up front, the roasted pineapple, and some gingerbread cake coming from that maltiness. So what you've seen here today is the amazing things that are happening in the Skagit Valley. In fact, they call it the magic Skagit up here because of all of the things that are happening. Not just because of the beauty, the landscape, the ability to grow world-class grains, fruits, vegetables, all of that other stuff, but there's a community and a sense of purpose here that's driving the world of agriculture forward. And what you've been able to see today, from the bread lab to the farms to Skagit Valley malting, all of this community and these partnerships are vital for us to try to drive our development of whiskey forward into the future. Hello and welcome to the Peat Bog that we work with here in Shelton, Washington. We're about an hour and a half's drive southwest of our distillery in Seattle, so still on the Puget Sound. And this peat bog, well, there's 50,000 acres of peat in Washington state, but this peat bog is the only peat bog that we have ever worked with. And there's more than enough peat that we could ever possibly use in a lifetime. Now, this peat bog has been really special to us because it's been part of our journey from the beginning. In fact, in 2011, we found this peat bog and we said, hey, let's start making peated whiskey with peat from just south of the distillery in Seattle. And that was a great idea. We said, all right, let's go down there. We dug some up and said, we're ready to go. We're going to make some peated malts. But the problem is that no malting companies in America, and in fact North America, produced peated malts. We've never had to as a country. So when we approached the malting companies, they said, no, we don't do that. They didn't have the setup for smoking facilities or for peat specifically. So we were stuck. And that was a bit of a bummer, if we're honest. But we continued to push that project. It was 5 more years worth of research and development on top of that, working with our partners at Skagit Valley Malting to finally develop the very first peated malt, the very first commercially produced peated malt, at least that we're aware of, in the United States. And it's all come from this bog. Now, one of the things that made us so excited about working with this peat bog to begin with was actually what I'm stepping through right now and really actually stepping on. This is a plant called Labrador Tea. And I remember when we first came out here, we were stepping through here and this stuff is so thick that you can't help but break some of these leaves. And what this plant is a hyper aromatic, deciduous plant that drops these leaves every fall. And the smell is so powerful, it's so pungent. It's got this kind of aroma of like lavender and orange peel kind of rolled into one, and you can smell it as you're walking around. It's really extraordinary. But when you think about peat, you think about the moss that forms most peat bogs. But the reality is there's so many other plants here, and you can see looking around how much of the wildlife here is dictated by this Labrador tea. It's so influential, and when it drops its leaves, that becomes a huge part of the component of the peat. So this is just one of many species of plants that's going to contribute to the uniqueness of flavor of this peat. Now, what you must be immediately noticing, in fact, looming behind me, is this giant machine, this backhoe. And actually, this is what is used to harvest the peat. And I know that, when we think about peat, we think about Scotland. There's this romantic notion, you go out there with your spade shovel and you cut these bricks, you lay them to the side. And in fact, that's the way it's been done for a long time in the Scottish whiskey industry. But, that's never been practiced here. So we're starting and looking at it from a brand new perspective. Harvesting it with the backhoe is more efficient for sure, but there's actually a much more important reason why we want to harvest with a backhoe the way that we do. The way that it's done in Scotland, when you see these spades going into the ground, this is called a cut and drain method. So what happens is a big trench is cut out of the peat bog, allowing all the water to flow out. That makes it much easier to go in there with your spade and cut and harvest these peat bricks. And that sounds great. The problem is once all that water is gone, all of this wildlife that survives here and thrives here is no longer able to access it. And so the ecosystem is damaged. So one of the things here that we're really proud of this peat bog, the way that the owner works with this peat bog, is that it's not cut and drain. The peat bog is constantly flooded with water. So when we harvest peat with the backhoe, what they're doing is going in there and pulling. It looks like pulling a giant bucket of mud out of the water. And while that looks a lot different from the way that it's done in Scotland with the spade in the ground, it's actually a much more sustainable method of harvesting peat. That way the ecology of this landscape remains intact. All the wildlife that thrive here still have a habitat, and it's just a different way of doing things. Now, one of the main challenges that we have actually through the whole Outpost range is that we're doing stuff that is brand new to the world of whiskey. And while that's really exciting, that also means that the scope of the idea needs to be much bigger than just us using a new raw ingredient. Because when it comes to us using, new peat, for example, there's a whole chain of people that need to be involved. The owner of the bog who's harvesting this peat for us, the maltster, us, and anybody else who can tell us about the peat. And actually, in my opinion, I think this project of our 3 projects within the Outpost range is the most difficult. And the reason being for that is the idea of studying peat doesn't really exist here. There's some studies of peat for, for wood products and things like that. But the reality is, in the way that Scotland studies peat and its effects on whiskey, that's never been done in this country. So while we're trying as hard as we can, there's also a lack of expertise. We're still learning along the way. I mean, we've been looking at this peat bog, working with this peat bog for 9 years. The reality is we're just getting started. Now, if you haven't been able to find your sample bottle of Solum in the package we sent you, it's not because it's a trick or because we don't like you. It's actually just because the whiskey isn't ready yet. We've been doing this process for almost 10 years. Kind of hard to believe, almost 10 years. Been making this whiskey for almost 5. But the reality is we're still waiting on accumulating enough casks for a proper release. Now, we're really excited about what we've tasted so far. For me, the flavor profile of what we've tasted from this bog right here is something I would describe like Christmas mezcal, if that makes any sense. Imagine the Christmas spices that you could get with the funky earthiness of a really good mezcal. It's hard to explain, but it's really, really good. And the beauty of that, not just that it's good, but also that it's unique and it's representative of this bog, this place, the Pacific Northwest that we call home. And we're announcing it now because this is what the Outpost range is all about. It's out exploring what are the possibilities in single malt whiskey. And we're excited to share it with you guys when the time comes.